you read a book, you listen to a podcast, but you don't feel any emotion from it, right? You might logically process, you might logically internalize, you might have some understanding, but you put the book down later and nothing in your life's really changed. Like, how often have you read a self-development book or listened to, a podcast, an inspirational talk, and you read it and you're like, wow, this is cool. But then like a day later, a week later, nothing's changed, right? Or maybe a little bit changed, but not as much as you want to.
So to add to that conundrum, even if something has changed, how do you know it just wasn't organic? Right. How do you know it was because of the book or because of the advice? And how do you know, even if, like, let's say you made a concerted effort after reading the book, right? So you had like a set of mental events and recollections. You're like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to intend to do this. And then this is going to be the outcome of that. Or how do you know you actually implemented that? But how do you know that the outcome wasn't generated by that? How do you know it wasn't just dumb luck? So I'll go like perfect example would be to go to the dating sphere. It's a perfect example would be like just telling someone, listen, man, all you need to do is you just need to be confident. Go up there and shake your booty or whatever, right? You just need to exude that masculinity or that testosterone, whatever. Let's say the person goes up, turns out that it worked, but maybe the reason that it worked wasn't because of the confidence. Maybe it was because like 1,000 other variables or 1,000 other factors like looks, money, status. Maybe she already had a crush on that guy. Like there's so there's so many possibilities there. But overall, to go back to the question, sorry about that side rant, that side tangent there. To go back to the question, definitely, I've definitely read a lot of content. And basically what's happening here is it's being processed in terms of mental stimulation. It's occupying my bandwidth. It's interesting. It's stimulating. In fact, you know what? It's like watching a movie, or it's like reading a good book.
Yeah, you get that dopamine hit, right? You feel good about yourself. You're like,
you really do.
Something.
Yeah.
But then has anything really changed at the fundamental level? And I think it's because you're processing so logically, and if it doesn't have any meaning to you, you don't truly internalize it, then it's not going to be as impactful as it could be. It might be impacting you a little bit, maybe, you don't know. And so the real question is, and this is more regarding changing who you want to be rather than learning something necessarily, because if you're learning something, this can be useful too, but I think more having a shift in you. How do you go about doing that? And what I think is really a necessary component or an important component is believing in something. And when I say belief, I don't mean it like because often when people say belief, they think, oh, belief equals religion, right? And so they almost turn themselves off to that idea because of some preconceived, notion or judgment. But what you might not realize is belief is very powerful, and it doesn't have to be in terms of religion. It could be, but we're not going to be talking about religion today. That's a completely different topic to get into. It's a whole another can of worms, which has its own power as well. But we're going to be talking about belief to elicit that shift.
Just in terms of like obvious examples. So for example, at university, I studied philosophy. In philosophy, there's a branch of philosophy called epistemology. Epistemology is basically, if I say it in like a word format, it's basically how do we know anything that we know, right? And if you think about the order, so of course belief is it plays a significant role in the branch of epistemology, because before knowledge, of course, comes belief. And if you go by, for example, if you go by Aristotle, he would actually just argue, or this was his exact definition of knowledge, which is pretty much still universal. It is contested in our little academic circles, but to the common person on the street, basically, when they think of knowledge, they're going to be going through this process of what is called justified true belief. So in order for something to be knowledge, right, it has to be the first condition in that definition is it has to be true. So it's a true belief. It's not just because people have all sorts of bizarre beliefs, but it has to be a true belief in order to constitute as knowledge. And the second factor, of course, is that a true belief typically has to be justified. It can't just be asserted. You can't just make a random claim. It can't just be relying on random informations or byproducts of chemicals or faith claims or belief claims. It has to be ultimately justified, right? So here's an example that we might bring up in, say, epistemology. Again, it has no religious connotations whatsoever. Might be, for example, if you're being chased by a tiger and there's a cliff and you've got to jump 1 meter. Now, let's say for argument's sake, you're being chased by a tiger, there's a cliff and you could fall to your death, right? And you've got 1 meter to jump. Now, let's say for the sake of argument, as I was saying, that you've never actually really jumped before, or maybe let's say in the minimum, at the least, you haven't jumped 1 meter, let's say, right? So so basically in philosophy, in epistemology here, basically what a pragmatist would argue is that there is a sort of pragmatic value to having belief in this situation, irrespective of what one might consider realism, but the reality of the situation. Whether that person, for example, has the physical and cognitive capacities to make such a leap and survive is like an objective matter of fact kind of question or condition, right? Yeah. But in terms of his psychology, what's going to be the most beneficial overall goodness to in terms of conduciveness to jumping over that building, as if someone's freaking running fast from a tiger and they're like, I'm gonna make it, I'm not gonna die today, boom, then it's obviously going to be more likely that even if a belief is false, objectively speaking, maybe he doesn't make it, but you want to be able to have that belief in this context because of the pragmatic value, because of the potential beneficial outcome that it will induce.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you don't know what's going to happen, right? Jumping over that cliff, you don't know if you're going to make it, but having that belief is so beneficial because it's the thing you need in that moment to achieve that result. And so it doesn't matter about what is correct when it comes to belief, when it comes to shift or change, like jumping over the cliff, achieving a goal. What matters more is having that belief that you can achieve it. And that indirectly and sort of ironically almost helps you get over that cliff, get to that other side. And this leads into, and I think you mentioned it, how do you know anything? And it's really tough to know and validate that a claim is true. You could even argue that nobody really knows anything. Does anybody know anything? And when you realize that, and you start questioning how people are coming up with their assumptions and coming up with what they think and the claims they make, then you start realizing that people are almost faking what they know. It's almost like faking it till you make it in your career, in your job, whatever. People act very confident in the claims they make. But when you think about it, do they actually know if these claims are true? But then I could argue, does it matter if they know? They might not be conscious that they are, in a sense, bullshitting themselves, but it's still helping them. It's still helping them because they can then go into that job or go into that scenario and have a bit more of that confidence. It's a double-edged sword, and I agree that you need to have that awareness. And that's where I'm stressing realizing this, that nobody knows everything, gives you freedom. It gives you freedom because when you know that nobody knows anything, it's freeing. You can freely admit, hey, I don't know what's going on. What's going on in life? Does anyone know? Do you know? Do you know, Mark? No. So you can kind of realize that nobody knows anything, realizing that's freeing. But when you know that nobody knows anything, you can get some confidence in the fact that you don't know, right? Because you don't know, you can feel confident in simply the claim that I don't know. I'm confident that I don't know. That is useful, right? Because when you know that you don't know, you can start building on top of that. That's almost your foundation, and you can start realizing of things and saying, it doesn't matter that I can't validate this, because things are very hard to validate. It doesn't matter. What it does mean is I can build on top of this.
It's amazing that you're coming up with this just as, you know, a byproduct of your process of thinking and your thoughts, because basically, again, I mentioned epistemology earlier, which is our theories of knowledge. There's actually a position exactly more or less as you described just then. It's actually called foundationalism. So it's basically, if I were to describe the thematic pattern or the overall structure of it, is basically you want to reduce all of everything that you think you know, everything that you think you believe, and you want to reduce it to something that is very small and tiny, and something you can grasp on, put your grasp around, and you're like, I can actually know that. And in this case, an example of that, which you might have just given or displayed, would be the observation or the realization that actually I don't really know shit all. So when you're saying I don't really know shit all, you could even argue, and in fact, this is kind of ironic. You could even some skeptics are so skeptical, they're called pyrrhonic skeptics in the history of philosophy, that they actually thought that itself was also a knowledge claim. So when someone realizes that they don't know shit all, they were like, well, do I know that? And then they're like, no, I don't want to claim to know that either. So they became like basically they became like radical skeptics. They became like the worst kind of skeptics to the point where it was literally pragmatically ridiculous.
Worse than anti-vaxxers, huh?
I mean, to be fair, there's I would say that was like the most extreme form of skepticism you could possibly come to and conclude. But there are some versions of skepticism that are not necessarily that extreme. You can sort of go up in the hierarchy a little bit. But for now, let's just stop where you are a little bit, because I don't think that was the ultimate intention of people who, like Socrates, for example. Socrates, a perfect example of a very ancient Greek philosopher who knew that he knew nothing. He, for example, one of his quotes is, there's many great quotes, of course, but one of his quotes is something like, again, I'm paraphrasing this, there's something like, there's two kinds of people. Basically, in the first category, you've got the fool who thinks that he's wise. And then in the second category, of course, you have the wise person who truly knows that they're actually a fool. And that's closer, of course, to what he's saying a philosopher, a method of philosophy or approach to philosophy that even you just utilized without, of course, following the trajectory to the history to, it was that guy said it. It's like, no, you figured it out on your own. You definitely figured it out on your own in that sense. But yeah, anyway, so going back to the belief side of the coin in terms of the so basically there's one other observation I'll make at this point, and that is basically, so for those of us, and you might be in this category, again, we all start off places and end other places anyway, so it might not even matter. But you might be in the category of someone who thinks, well, who really cares what the ultimate answer is? Who really knows if there is a God, or if there's no God, or if, for example, I really possess a soul, or do I lack a soul, or is my consciousness pretty much illusory, or is it not illusory? Of course, we take this. These are the fundamental, interesting questions we cover in like very early classes early on. So they're called the big questions. The class was called that one, right? And so some people might respond to that sort of situation, and they might say, I can't answer those questions, and I'll never really know the answers to those questions. But what I have found and what I have discovered is that belief works. Belief works. And so this group of people, again, I'm not representing them perfectly here, but they would be considered under the umbrella of pragmatism, or the pragmatists. If you want a popular cultural example of this, of someone who sort of fits into this picture a little bit, the example would be Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson doesn't want to fully make like really crazy claims about reality, where he just knows like there's a hierarchy of angels, and there's a hell, and there's a heaven, and there's demons, and there's an overall creator. He's more someone who examines the utility of belief. And he's someone who examines sort of like what would happen if we didn't have these sort of axioms, if we didn't have this sort of way of behaving. Basically, he would argue that our life would deteriorate without belief. He would be one of those people who would say, actually, humans actually cannot do anything but believe, because if they are to stop believing, the practical consequences, the practical effects would be so bad that basically your life would collapse in and of itself. As he would say, you would collapse into chaos. And that's why he thinks basically like the antidote to chaos is organization, it's structure, it's making your day one day better at a time, doing one thing better so that the day before, or doing one less worse thing, very pragmatic, so that your day is ultimately better every day, accumulatively and gradually. And this is especially helpful for those people who are on the doomer side of the scale, who are like, everything is over, everything is lost. We live in this postmodern world. We live in this post-truth world where just like my brain is scattered and there's information overload, and maybe I feel depressed now and I feel anxiety later, and everything is just chaotic for some people. And he's just saying, oh, hold on. Let's just come back to the pragmatic utility. Let's just come back to the pragmatic value of belief, and see how your life could be, and how you would then feel, back to that emotional side of it, would be radically different than if you just gave up and stopped believing.
Yeah, going to the topic of sort of where we form belief, because you said that we fundamentally as humans need to believe things, but where do these beliefs come from most people, right? They come from our conditioning, what people tell us, and what we hear, what we consume. Right. And absolutely. So that is so radically important when you realize how important belief is, that you've been exposed to so many different things which might not be serving you, or might not be in your best purpose. And so it's interesting that we, or a lot of people sort of understate or aren't interested in learning about belief and how it can help them when they are believing, but they don't realize it.
Exactly.
I think it's a woo-woo
there really is no such thing as what I would call like a belief error theorist. So basically there are people, let's say that God error theory would be the equivalent of atheism, right? You just basically say, well, the claim that there is a God is an error. Again, this is in philosophy. This is not common usage. This is philosophical usage. Then there's some people who might say, like my former thesis advisor, he would say there's moral error theory, right? Moral error theory, meaning there is no real objective morality out there in the sky, out the pie in the sky, in the universe, and so forth. Reality is more like a subjective condition of human beings. So in that sense, he's a moral error theorist. But here's what you could definitely argue. I mean, this is such an easy argument to make, is that really a belief error theorist doesn't exist, because even the person who is the most black-pilled, the person who has the worst doomer psychology, is ultimately a believer in some sense. He just and maybe perhaps even the most minimal sense that you could go. There's some beliefs that are occurring there, but he needs to restructure, reappropriate beliefs in a form of a structure in order to basically continue to live and to continue to exist. You can't exist without these sorts of beliefs. It's impossible. Even if they're false beliefs, as you were saying, like you were talking about social conditioning, which is basically other than empirical first-hand conscious experience, it is the primary way in which we adopt all and any thinking, beliefs, thoughts, language, of course, ideas, but beliefs included. So yeah, I completely agree with you in terms of like belief being fundamental. I really don't know if I could even, here's a challenge for you, Dylan. I'll challenge myself as well. But really, is there any devil's advocate argument that you could potentially make? Again, this is all off the cuff, so we haven't really thought about this in advance, to where like a human being could have zero beliefs and be fully black-pilled in that sense. Now, someone could say, well, someone could potentially have no beliefs if all they have is all knowledge. Hey, maybe that's God. Maybe God has no beliefs and he only has knowledge, right? But of course, that's a very abstract, hypothetical example. The pragmatists and other groups of philosophers, like the existentialists and others, they would want to bring us back down to earth, a little bit closer to earth anyway, and think like, is there, obviously there's no one, even if someone did claim to only have knowledge, first of all, we might think that they belong in an asylum. That's actually possible. That we would be like, whoa, this person is crazy. they think that all they have is knowledge. A lot of people would think that person is a little bit cuckoo. Not saying that's right or wrong, because popularity is obviously not a good decider. It's not a good criterion. But yeah, like, is there any example you could come up with, or I could come up with, where absolutely zero beliefs in a practical sense that a human being could have, and he could like just keep going and existing and flourishing, or even not flourishing? I think the point being is that someone who doesn't have beliefs is ultimately going to face an incoming imminent death of some type. Even if it's not physical, it will perhaps be psychological.
That's a really good point. I think it goes to what we define as belief as well. So I suppose that is something like the necessary parameter, because if you're saying that things could be objective, for example, color, or water, things like that, they aren't belief concepts, those are things. If you define them as things, then you could probably live your life outside of that, right? And be able to function in a certain way. And I imagine you could probably come up with a system where you don't necessarily agree or disagree with things, but in itself, that's a belief. So that's sort of the contradictory thing, is by nature of the word, you kind of need to be somewhere. It's not something where you can be off the system, because in itself, it requires you to be in the space of belief. even if you don't believe in belief, it's still within the space of belief. So it's a bit of a strange one.
Yeah, I mean, basically what you're arguing at that point is, as you said, it's about definition, which ultimately means it's about semantics, right? So it's a semantics sort of issue. And of course, people are very pedantic about semantics, well, at least in my background, especially because we have these types of conversations, all sorts of conversations, but an obviously popular conversation, at least this discourse was popular back in like the 2010, 2011 era, would be the new atheist discourse of people being pedantic about what exactly is the definition of atheism, how to identify as an atheist, because theists and atheists always contest this. And to be honest, I think that's going to be like a never-ending debate / discussion. It's always going to be like that. But in philosophy, just like in science, in a sense, you have to have a common ground in order to get off to get things started, to get the conversation started. And that's why although I would say there is some variance with definitions of belief among philosophers and theologians and whatnot, there also has to be like a common ground definition so that we can actually have a conversation, so that we can have a discourse with one another. And under that perception, under that understanding of belief, as far as I know, the belief in the external world around us. So you gave an example earlier of like, well, it's not really a belief because this is like a rock. I can touch it. I can feel it. I can smell it. Who knows what the hell a rock smells like, though?
What kind of rock is that? Don't think that's
what
a
kind
rock.
of person smells a rock? But of course, so in philosophy, we would definitely go towards the skeptical side of things there, and we would say, well, even in order to get off the ground, in order to think that there's a rock in front of me, that I'm touching the rock, then you would have to have a sort of certain faith, a certain confidence, a certain trust in your own cognitive faculties, in your own sensory experience. When, of course, you could argue also, of course, that even in the less extreme version of skepticism, where we're questioning every sense experience and we're questioning everything we're experiencing, is that really how it is? That's more like Descartes. If you've ever heard of Descartes, he's famous for like, I think, therefore I am. That's his quote, or at least a translation of it. So there's you got Descartes there, but when it comes to these, sorry, I've just lost my what would I just say? What did I bring up just before Descartes?
Oh man, I'm confused.
Oh, I know what I brought up. Yeah, so I was going to go to a simple example of skepticism. So a more simple example of skepticism would be like just a cognitive illusion, right? So Descartes had that more radical skepticism. He had that more like, is there an external world? Or is it kind of like a dream? Like when I'm dreaming, I don't know the difference between the external world and my world. It just seems to be the same thing, right? So then we can question the same thing, of course, when we're awake, if we grant that assumption. We can say, well, is that external world really there? But let's take it to a more practical, mild or moderate version of skepticism. And let's just say, well, there is a world out there, but we do still also have cognitive illusions. So there's a lot we can't be certain of. Like reflections in the ocean and so forth and such. So there's that as well. So, but no matter what, I can't. So in terms of belief, that going back to the definition of belief in philosophy, because we have that common ground in most of the conversations, of course, other than conversations where we talk about what belief might mean, and then we can have like different categories of belief or meanings of belief. But the one that we use to common together, to talk together, yes, but belief, even in an external world, is kind of like a leap of faith. For at least if you're a Descartian, At least if the philosophy that derives from that is foundationalism, then that is also a belief. Sorry, man.
Right. Bringing it back a little more grounded, so the viewers could get a bit of a practical benefit from this. Taking that idea of well, at some point in time you have to believe something, but I think it's really common that people think they believe something, but they don't necessarily believe it. And where's the issue here? I think the issue here is what does it mean to believe something? You have to hold a set of assumptions, right? A set of assumptions that reinforce that belief. Even if you are believing something and perhaps there's no assumption, but that's still an assumption. So you need a set of assumptions. And those assumptions are important. And the reason they're important, in my opinion, is when you have those assumptions, they give you confidence in what you believe, because now you have a reason for it. For example, you were talking about you still need to rely on your eyesight or your body to perceive the external world. So you are, in some sense, believing in that thing, in that assumption that you can see, that you can speak, that you can interact in the world. And so let's say the viewer wanted to believe something. How do they go about doing that? I think the first step, in my opinion, before you get into the emotional side of things, which I think is equally important and we'll touch on soon, but the first step is to list out the assumptions that lead to the thing. And let's say you want to be more confident. It doesn't matter if those assumptions aren't accurate now. It doesn't matter if the assumption that perhaps I'm a really good speaker, so that makes me confident, doesn't necessarily matter if that's not true now. That's also in itself a belief, right? An assumption is also another belief. You don't really know if anything's true. Mm-hmm. But having those things which point to something else, so these imply this, which something else implies that, I think that's really powerful. And that's the first step in practically mapping out how to create or transform yourself by believing in something. What are your thoughts on that?
So basically what you described as a set of assumptions is the equivalent of what I was referring to as common ground between philosophers. So you can't have a conversation, you can't get your foot off the ground unless you've already made a set of assumptions. As you put it, you have to have a set of assumptions no matter what. And this is what in philosophy would be like just axiomatic almost. This is the type of thing that cannot be, for example, it cannot be rationally grounded or logically grounded. I mean, you could rationally describe this and you could logically describe this and you could even defend certain arguments with these assumptions and such. So in that sense, it can be. But in the ultimate sense, we are dependent on these assumptions first, and thus all of our rationalizations are, in a sense, post hoc or ad hoc. We're sort of we're post-rationalizing or we're backwards rationalizing. So we can't do anything. This is a sort of common point that, and again, going back to Jordan Peterson, he would make this. He makes this sort of point all the time. Is that he would go even further than that. Not only would he say we have like a set of assumptions, but we need a set of assumptions, and we sort of need an entire religious or social system that this transforms into. And then we kind of, and again, we have some control over that, but we don't have like complete control. And so the fact that we can, for in the case of Peterson, he would say, listen, there's always going to be a social hierarchy, a social dominance hierarchy. There's nothing we can do about that. even if you want to supposedly, dismantle a hierarchy, you're still going to have a hierarchy of some kind. Yeah. There's always going to, even if it's more something closer to an egalitarian hierarchy. That's another example of that. But again, you can go through all of these examples where these are just almost axiomatic, even in like sociological, like it's very difficult to evade this or escape this. So yeah, I certainly agree. I certainly agree with your point. But I was interested, by the way, like, so for you, I guess my question for you, because this is definitely a subject on your mind lately, would be like, what's the connection between like belief and emotions? Like, can you lay this out like in your way or explicitly? What's the connection here?
Okay, I would say there's three components. Say there's assumptions, which is the first thing we were referring to, and those lead into you believing something. So that's why it's so important to identify your assumptions, because if your assumptions aren't good, then you're not going to be believing the thing you want to be believing. So those two are really important, really key components. The last one goes into emotion. We are very emotional animals, right? We are humans. We are not robots. So we need to make the most use of one of the most important things or components of a human, which is to be emotional about things. I think this is really suppressed and not talked about, how useful emotion is. When you think of emotion, what do you think of? The angry man, the emotional girl, the whatever, any sort of stereotype you can think of. And it's used in a derogatory sense, whereby it's not aiding them. It's bad. You shouldn't be emotional.
Right.
But there's another side to it, which is emotion is so important to decide things. It's so important to, and by decide, I don't mean in a logical sense. I mean, if you want to have a shift in your life, because, and this is backed by science, the more you want to focus or have a change, the more likely it's going to happen, or the more that is happening within your body to actually result in that. Like if you really want to focus, or you really want to learn something, and Andrew Huberman has an amazing podcast on this. He talks about how as a child, it's very easy to learn, right? You just learn any information which comes your way, very passive. But as you get older, past 25 or so, you need to be more active in the way you learn. And the way you learn, just as well as a child, or at least better, is by focusing and having the intention that you really want to learn this thing. So you have to put a bit more effort in, but that part of, I want to do this, I want to learn this thing, I want to focus, gives you that focus and helps you learn that thing really well. That is the thing people need to do. But we're so conditioned at a young age to not learn that skill. But that is the most important skill. And that is why purpose matters so much for people. People say, do what you're passionate about. That really comes into play as you get older, where, well, if you're not passionate about something, you're not going to be focused, not be learning it. You're not going to be learning it as well because of, well, how the human body works. So that is why belief is important to elicit that emotion. And emotion is important for belief and vice versa. And so how do you actually go about getting emotional about something now that we know that it's so useful? You need to, and I suppose everybody knows how to create an emotion, but it can still be a tough thing to do. I can't exactly explain how it's going to work in you. We're all individuals, but it's about focusing on creating or eliciting a certain feeling. For example, let's say you wanted to be more confident, logically realizing that you should be confident, it's a first step. It's better than nothing, right? But you're probably not going to feel confident. If you want to feel confident, you need to start having that shift in your body. So here's actually another connection, which is the body and emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And we know from body language that the body language, but your body kind of changes how you feel in a moment. If you are open up more, you're going to feel more confident and vice versa. And this goes into lots of different other domains too, not just confidence. So we know there's some body component too, some neurological component, but we know that mentally you can change how you feel in your body. So it's a feedback loop, and you want to get into this feedback loop and really elicit a change. If you can elicit this change, things are going to be more impactful for you. And my advice, or something that works for me and it works really well for a lot of other people to start to get into this, is actually just to meditate. And the reason is because a lot of people are not good at sitting down and paying attention to themselves and their own processes, their own neurology. When you can sit down and listen to yourself, listen to your mind, listen to how you think and what emotions are stirring in your body, you can start to work things out. You can start to map things out mentally. Oh, I'm like this, I'm like that because of XYZ, and these things are impacting me in this way. Not only that, but you'll have a bit more control. You'll start to learn how to elicit a greater change in a certain way. Confidence, calmness, relaxation, anxiety. You'll start to notice these patterns. So I think the first area to focus on to create emotion, if you can't do it already, is to focus on meditation. What are your thoughts?
I guess the first question is like, what is ultimately your goal here? Because in a sense, if you're doing meditation, right, you're actually reducing emotion. Arguably, or reducing emotion, or you use the word controlling emotion in a sense. So you're ultimately controlling emotion. So it depends what you want to do. Whereas someone, if you want to refer to like those physiological exercises and activities that you just mentioned, would almost be the opposite of meditation in that sense, right? Because in that sense, you're trying to produce, you're creating a specific emotional experience. Whereas with meditation, you're sort of like, you want to get that experience under control, or you want to reduce it, or you want to accept it, whatever your goal is. However, in saying that, there's a potential response to these points. So for example, you could say, well, both physiological activity and meditation are just both ways of inducing various emotional states. So maybe they're not exactly the same identical state, but they will ultimately produce some sort of emotions. But I'm not sure if the common practitioners of meditation, by that I don't mean just random yoga teachers and meditation teachers in the West. I mean more like in terms of like people from the Eastern traditions or mystical traditions. I'm not exactly sure if they would grant that the goal and the ends of meditation is to induce a specific emotional state. But at the same time, they might say something close. I think maybe they would like appeal to the Buddha in the sense that that he didn't gain anything from meditating, but what he lost was something like anxiety, dread, depression. But again, this is a very, as you said, we said earlier, this is a very semantic based issue.
Yeah, I would like to elaborate, because I feel like I didn't define meditation correctly.
Sure. Okay.
I would totally agree with what you're saying. Traditional meditation is about focusing, almost having a decrease in emotional state. And that is really important. And I think people should do that too. But the sort of meditation I want to sort of present today is a type of meditation where you are actively focused on creating some sort of emotion.
Okay. Yep.
And the way you do it, and the easiest way, is through some sort of transformational entertainment material. For example, a video or a song. You want to feel inspired and on purpose. Play a song that is inspirational, that uplifts you, that makes you feel a certain way. And just don't play it in the background, but actually sit there and listen to it, and maybe even put an affirmations track on the background or whatever. Or you can just say it in your mind, say different affirmations if you want, but sit there and really feel like you are what is some sort of archetype or some sort of feeling that you want to invoke.
Yes.
So you want to feel powerful. Sit there, I'm powerful. You feel this power in you, creating this shift. And the more you do it, the more you'll feel like that thing you are trying to elicit. So it's a different.
So you become kind of a form of an embodiment of it, at least in terms of your own internal and psychological experience. You become it. I guess that's the goal, in the sense that you want to become it. You want to become identical with it, identical with that emotion or that archetype, the same and one with it, so that you're not separate or other than it, but you are it. And then you can sort of really induce what exactly that emotion is. And even furthermore, that will give you like a psychological insight into why maybe, in this case, so for some people, right, they have incredibly hard time understanding, let's say, another set of spiritual or religious beliefs, or any spiritual religious or beliefs for that matter. Some people just can't resonate with that at all. But this is actually a form of meditation that you're actually speaking about here, that could actually not only benefit you and your belief, but it will help you to understand an entire network or community. But yeah, so I guess my next question is on this part of it, where then after let's say you have really assimilated and sort of amalgamated into this emotional state that you're experiencing, where then is the connection to belief from this point?